to talk about cults for the next 6 weeks or so. And this week will really be an introduction. And this, the inspiration for this series came from a dinner I had back in May with someone who asked me, what is a cult? And that's a really good question because there are multiple answers to that question. And we're going to talk about 3 of the answers to that question today. And David, on I think Sunday, said, spoiler alert, you're not a member of a cult, but you are. So let's talk first. Well, first of all, let's talk about what we're not going to be talking about over the next few weeks. This week is an introduction. What we are not going to be talking about is the occult. What's the difference between a cult and the occult, or what is the definition of the occult? Yeah, anything that kind of falls into that sort of instrumental paganism or Satanism, witchcraft, voodoo, things where you're sort of channeling spirits, you're involved in that kind of stuff. That is the occult. We're not going to talk about that other than right now, this moment. We're not going to talk about cults of other religions for the most part. We will talk about, we'll wind up talking about Scientology, which is not exactly a cult of other religions. It's really just its own religious cult, sort of standalone thing. But we're not going to talk about cults of other major religions, again, other than right now at this moment. Can anybody think of an example of a cult spin-off of Judaism? Kind of, yeah. And I'll actually mention them under one of the examples of cults there. But yeah, Samaritans. What about a contemporary one? Yeah, Kabbalah. Yeah, that was exactly the one I was thinking of. Yeah, and that kind of plays into the occult a little bit. Can you think of a cult of Islam? Mm-hmm.
There were these tribes that could mix their indigenous practices with Islam, and it just really resembled
Yeah.
Islam.
Yeah. And a lot of the major religions, just about every major religion has sort of cult sects or spin-offs of it. But an example of an Islamic or a cult that had its origins in Islam that we see around here a lot is Baha'i. So that's a anyway. Like I said, we're not going to talk about that except right now. We're not going to talk about political cults, the LaRouche movement or the SLA. Anybody remember? I actually don't remember because I was a little bit too young. I remember Patty Hearst got kidnapped, right? But I didn't remember anything about it. But she was kidnapped by a political cult called the SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army. Al-Qaeda is a political cult of Islam. And then in general, what we're not going to be talking about, or what is not a goal, is talking about how to win an argument against or debate with a member of a cult. That's not what we're here for, okay? So what are we going to talk about? What are we here for? My goal is to give a general overview of the type of cults with examples we might commonly run into in order to understand the basics of their beliefs and practices, including their flaws. And rather than providing a detailed apologetic of Orthodox Christianity against the cults in question, my intention is to give you enough information to recognize the central problems and develop a basic discernment regarding both false teaching and inappropriate behaviors. So job one is build discernment, And job 2 is build understanding of our neighbor, because you know people that are in cults. I promise. So I want to talk a little bit briefly at an introductory level on gray area, okay? In every one of the types of cults that we're going to discuss, there may be dispute as to exactly when a group has crossed the line into cult territory. Sometimes it's absolutely clear, and sometimes it's less so. And this is where I'll mention the kind of blurry distinction between denominations, sects, and cults, right? It really isn't like boxes or even a Venn diagram. It's more like a continuum from, the general identification of a religion on one end to a cult on the other end. And in between, you've got things like dispensations, or you have what are called sects. And the line here is where it's really blurry, where does it become, and part of the reason that line is really blurry is because of what we'll talk about when we differentiate between the three different types of cults we're going to talk about tonight. So a little bit about cults in America. In the late 19th century saw an explosion in the development of new cults and cult-like sects. The Second Great Awakening had a big part in this. There was a lot of emotionalism, a lot of visions that were relied on to build religious practice and religious belief. An emphasis on new methods. This is a phrase you saw a lot in the Great Awakening. Emphasis on miracles. So what you see is this kind of explosion of this happening, particularly in the United States. You also saw it in England a lot. There's a really tight relationship naturally between what goes on in England and what happened in England and what happened in the United States when it comes to Protestant religious development. And a lot of that is because many of the original colonies were English colonies, right? So they brought over with them cultural developments that had been fomenting in England since the Reformation. You also saw a really strong Anabaptist influence in English and American churches that arguably contributed to this, and that is because Anabaptist ideas really are aggressively anti-organization. They're anti-creedal. They don't like a committed to. They're very. You'll hear phrases like "no creed but Christ," right? So the idea of a confessional standard, the idea of a denominational organization to sort of hold the line on heresy, those things were really resisted by the Anabaptist tradition. The Anabaptist tradition was also very skeptical of ordination in general. So they really flattened out. They took the idea of the priesthood of all believers to a sort of extreme level, and as a result, the idea of somebody going to seminary, somebody being vetted by peers, and the congregations being protected by institutions was really something the Anabaptist traditions resisted, and that coincided with the liberalization of the mainline churches, right? So the mainline churches, Presbyterianism, Lutheranism, Methodism, Episcopalianism, they were busy fighting their own fight over the modernist controversy, right? So what you start seeing in the mid-1900s, or mid-1800s rather, is this explosion of new sects and cults and small religions. This was also aided in America by the rapid Western U.S. growth and migration, and the accompanying hucksters, charlatans, and con artists that went along with that. And so you see a significant overlap between the founders of cults and people that were previously maybe run out of town because they were a con artist, or thrown in jail because they were a con artist. So you see that sort of thing. So let's talk about the three kinds of cults. So the first type, and when I said you are a part of a cult, this is the type that you're a part of, okay? Does anybody know the Latin word that we get the word cult from?
Isn't it the word for word? No. In French, the word for a worship service, a project worship service.
Yeah. And cultus is or cultus, I think is the Latin pronunciation of it. And it really is a word for any kind of, well, I wrote down one of the OED definitions. A particular form or system of religious worship or veneration, especially as expressed in ceremonies or rituals which are directed toward a specific figure or object. So the place in the first century, and even the century before, where you would hear the word or read the word cultus in the Roman Empire was referring to the Roman imperial cult, right? So it was really that religious system of worshiping the emperor, right? But it is a general, non-pejorative term, right? It just describes any system that has these sort of rituals, system of religious worship or veneration, and it directed toward a specified figure or object. So, distinctive markers include structure, ritual, and an object of worship. So, the Roman imperial cult, of course, but the Mosaic cult, right? The system set up under Moses to worship God, to provide sacrifices. You know, that is often, you'll see in some academic literature, they'll refer to that system as the Mosaic cult, right? But Christianity itself is a cult by this definition, right? Focused on a central figure or object, Jesus Christ, right? It is certainly organized. It has a system of rituals and ceremonies. There's no reason to be afraid of applying this definition of cult to Christianity, except of course for the fact that that's not what anybody means when they use the word cult, right? But I did want to mention that this is the origin of the term, right? And it didn't take on a negative connotation until much, much later. So now if this sort of formality as a general definition is what defines this first kind of cult, can you think of any examples that would be counterexamples? Something that would be a religion but wouldn't necessarily or would barely fall into this category.
Like something very disorganized, but still religious.
Sure, yeah.
Marianne Williamson.
I actually don't know who that is.
Okay. Yeah, kind of, like the kind, or like Deepak Chopra, like the kind of,
Sure.
where it's so vague. It's clearly a movement and it's clearly spiritual,
Yeah.
but I don't even think of like Deepak Chopra could explain what he believes there.
Yeah.
American Buddhism.
Sure. The phrase that I totally associate with this counterexample with disorganization or not being a cult in this original sense is spiritual but not religious, right? Very common American identity, spiritual but not religious. But arguably, a lot of Eastern style beliefs veer in this direction, right? It's no surprise that the word cultus came from Western culture, right? Now, that's not to say that Eastern beliefs like Hinduism and Buddhism don't have some structure, right? But they lean further away from that formality, and you definitely have movements within those religions that go even further. Transcendental meditation, right? It's more methodology than it is formal beliefs, or there's not necessarily an object of worship. Zen Buddhism is very non-culty in that sense of the word, right? So those are a couple of examples of informal religious practice. But I think the one you see just all the time is spiritual but not religious, and the second would be, as Annalise indicated, New Age, right? And we'll talk about New Age a little bit more, but it really does resist any kind of being able to pin it down. And the examples that David gave as well, the same thing. Okay, so type 1 is formality, I call it, right? Type 2 is heresy, right? So the second type of cult is, sorry. Nope, that has no eraser on it. That one's not very good. Take 3. So we've got formality, and then the second is heresy. Okay, so this definition of cult really centers around false teaching. It's a religious sect or group with beliefs and or practices that deviate significantly from the primary group. Okay, and this is probably, when you hear in Protestant religious circles, you hear the word cult, this is probably the first definition that most people think of, right? It's a cult because they deny something foundational, right? Something really important. So a distinctive marker is, of course, aberrant teaching, right? So a quick review, we've talked about this several times before. We talked about heresy and orthodoxy, right? And when we talk about Christian orthodoxy and what represents something where deviation from it would make you unchristian, right? We talk about those things that I if you were here for the conversation, I talked about level 1 doctrines, level 2 doctrines, and level 3 doctrines. And level 1 doctrines are ones that all Christians share. Things like affirming the Nicene Creed, right? Even if you are not from a tradition that is creedal or, formally affirms the Nicene Creed, if you're a Christian, you believe in the Trinity. And if you believe in a definition of the Trinity that is at odds with the Nicene Creed, you have a major theological problem, right? So, and then as Protestants, we would also say salvation by faith alone would be an example of that, like level 1 doctrine, right? So when we talk about aberrant teaching or a Christian cult, we're not just talking about somebody that disagrees with us on who should be baptized, or somebody that disagrees with us on even cessation of spiritual gifts, or all sorts of doctrines that we separate from other groups on, right? But that doesn't make them a cult just because we disagree with them. But if they're denying the deity of Christ, right, probably a cult. Right? Okay. A reminder that not every heretical religion or sect is necessarily a cult. They might be apostate, which we would, as Protestants, tend to say is true of Rome, right? But we wouldn't call the Roman Catholic Church a cult, not in this sense, right? Likewise, Eastern Orthodox Church, right? Or they may have separated via schism. The Orthodox is an example of that, right? So you don't just jump into the cult label because somebody, even if somebody is not Orthodox, right? I was reading, just as I was kind of doing a little bit of my research on this, about the Armenian Apostolic Church, right? Which separated for weird politically and historically particular reasons, and as a result, may be outside of Nicene Orthodoxy, arguably are outside of Nicene Orthodoxy, but they actually find the Nicene Creed to be monophysite, right, which we would call a heresy, right? So again, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but the idea is that the Armenian Orthodox or Armenian Apostolic Church is not a cult. It's a sect with whom we have significant differences, right? So apart from aberrant teaching, a heretical cult could also be one that engages in esoteric practices, right? And you see this a lot. Annalise gave an example of, what was Buddhism? Oh, yeah. But you gave an example of somebody, when you were overseas, a syncretistic, yeah. Yeah, Central and South American Catholicism is very, I mean, a lot of Christian religion historically has struggled with syncretism, which means, for those of you that don't know, syncretism is bringing in practices from another religion or another local practice that are not native to our beliefs, right? So you will definitely see in Central and South American Catholic and even some Protestant practices bringing in of a very kind of occultic kind of practices, voodoo and talismans and things like that, and other behaviors that really didn't come from Christianity. It came from the religions that were already there. So sometimes they're original practices, but they're often brought in via syncretism. Examples would be baptism for the dead, certain forms of meditation, attempting to speak and hear directly to God, to angels or to the dead, right? You see that in various heretical cults, right? So I lump that into that same type 2 heresy type of cult, right? So an example of a cult that falls into this practice Annalise gave earlier, the Samaritans, historical example. False worship, right? When Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, he doesn't mince words about the fact that they worship God in the wrong place, right? She actually asks him the question, do we worship here? We're told we worship on this mountain, but you Jews believe that we're supposed to worship in Jerusalem, right? And Jesus says, Jerusalem, but the time is coming and now is, right, where we will worship God in spirit and in truth, right? But he in no way says, you know, it's been totally okay that you've been worshiping on this mountain, right? That was an aberrant practice that the Samaritans engaged in. Gnostics, historically, they have false teachings regarding matter and spirit, and it leads to and led to a false Christology, denying the material humanness of Christ. Some Gnostics were said to believe that Christ actually never physically touched the ground. He just kind of hovered an inch or so above the ground, because they had such a low view of matter and the material that they over-spiritualized their belief. And one of many reasons why Gnosticism is a false, cultic belief system. The Arians deviated from the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity. So these are some historical examples, but in today's world, the people you might run into that fall into this heretical definition of a cult would be oneness Pentecostals, who deny the Trinity, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, right? They deny really fundamental doctrinal essentials of Christianity. And this is where we get to the discernment thing, right? And I think I might have used this example before, that I think one of the most important things we can do to not fall victim to cult beliefs or false beliefs is the most important thing we can do, and the most important thing we can do for other Christians and for our children is to know the real thing, right? And the example my youth pastor always used to give, there was a time when people needed to engage in banking transactions, they would go to a building and they would exchange cash. And bankers, and tellers in particular, had to be really, really familiar with money and what's real money and what's false money. And the way that they would do that is they would start them off by just having them count and touch real money constantly. They'd give them stacks of money and have them count, add it up, sum it, because they're developing an important skill when it comes to counting the money there, but they're also developing a familiarity in their very fingertips of what real money feels like, right? Then, only after they had a great deal of experience with the real thing, would they start slipping in a counterfeit bill. So that when that person was going and counting that stack of money, and they got to the false bill, they could raise it and immediately know, this doesn't feel like the real thing, right? And so the most important thing we can do as Christians when it comes to engaging with this stuff, if you go and try to chase down every false belief and isolate it and identify it, it is just spiritual and cognitive whack-a-mole, right? You'll never get to the end of the falsehood, right? But the best thing in the world you can do is know what you believe and why you believe it. Know in depth why Christianity is true and not just have a fuzzy thing. We need to, in particular, when it comes to differentiating from cults, we need to understand Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the central being of the Orthodox Christian faith. In Christianity, or in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus' nature, being, personhood, incarnation, life, work, death, resurrection, ascension are described by Paul as being of first importance, right? Know who Jesus is and understand everything you can understand about the biblical Jesus, that Jesus actually taught in Scripture. All cults that call themselves Christian deny something fundamental about the person and or work of Christ. Right? This is the really central thing to look for when you're looking at a belief system that somebody is part of to identify if it's cultic. They deny something essential about Christ. And this is why the most important way to identify and refute this type of cult is to understand the Jesus of Scripture fully. Doctrine matters. It's not enough to just call ourselves Jesus followers. We must know the real Jesus, not a false Christ, and not a distraction going by his name. I should have stopped at each step along the way and asked for questions, and I didn't. Does anybody have any questions first about this first definition, formality, when it comes to the definition or the use of the word cult? Yeah, I'll read you this is one where I can actually get an OED definition. So, a particular form or system of religious worship or veneration especially as expressed in ceremonies or rituals which are directed toward a specified figure or object. Any questions or comments about heresy as a type of cult? Okay. So then our third type of cult that we'll talk about, the one-word definition or one-word label that I apply to it is manipulation. This is about power and control, a group that deploys methods to exercise control over and or exploit its members. So the distinctive markers that we see in these types of cults are they're very frequently, centered around a particular, often charismatic leader. Usually. Sometimes the control is exercised by an inner circle or other cabal, but it is really, really common that there's a person other than Jesus at the center of cults that exercise this kind of control. They commonly employ apocalyptic and or millennial language, right? To emphasize the special knowledge or the special place of that person, they really try to create a sense of urgency about the times we live in, right? Jesus could be coming back any minute, and only I know what we need to do to make sure we're right with him, right? Or it doesn't even need to be Christian, right? It's the last chance to leave planet Earth before it is recycled, right? So using that type of, we're on the cusp of either to instill fear or to instill a sense of wanting to be in on this thing that is coming. Apocalyptic and or millennial language. Manipulation in general is used by these kind of cults. This includes things like isolation, separation from friends and family, forcing dependency on tightly controlled community for relationships and support, right? And one of the things that is really challenging when it comes to, you see it in both heresy and manipulation. If somebody comes in and does something that's just completely contrary to what you know to be okay, right? They are unlikely to charm you, right? If somebody wants to convince you that they have the true Christianity, right, it doesn't do any good for them to never use words like Christ or Jesus or God, right? If a false Christianity wants to draw you in, they have to use those words and draw you in. Now, manipulation is a similar thing, right? These are good, community is a good thing, right? Mutual support is a good thing. Being in each other's lives, holding one another accountable, these are good things, right? But when it moves from encouraging one another to love and good deeds, protecting one another, to this isolating, separating, dividing, and insular practice, that's where it's starting to move across the line into manipulation. When you're discouraged from having anything to do with those outside of your particular group, when you're discouraged from sharing the beliefs or the practices of your particular group with others that are not part of that group, right? These are isolating practices, right? When you're encouraged never to, not just, for example, search for a future spouse who is a strong Christian, right? but rather being taught, you need to marry someone from this like teeny tiny little group, and we'll help you select that person, right? That's where you really get that isolating manipulation. If, yeah. Yeah. I was like straining for like what article of clothing, the little cap, if the knit sweater fits. um, Abuse. You see this a lot, and a lot of times it doesn't come out until a lot later. But um, once the manipulation and isolation has really taken hold, what you start seeing is abuse. Usually starts off as kind of psychological and emotional abuse, but very, very often it sinks into physical abuse, sexual abuse. This is something you see in these groups that manipulate and cut themselves off from external accountability. Cover-ups and excuses for bad behavior, right? Suppression of questions and or dissent, right? When the leader, when somebody prominent within the group questions the supreme leader's opinion, right? How does the group respond, right? Is asking a question welcome, or is it really pushed down? If a leader asks a question, are they separated? Are they removed? Shaming, shunning, expulsion, these sorts of things, again, it's not that we don't call sin sin, right? But it is a completely different thing. It's not that we don't practice excommunication. There's a healthy way that we separate. But there is a manipulative, cultic way of doing it as well. So examples of this type of cult, manipulative type cults. Scientology, huge example. Actually, probably a more famous than the number of people involved warrant example, just because so many celebrities are involved in it, and so a lot of people talk about it. But I mean, the practices are just like how to be a cult handbook, right? Jim Jones, right? Again, somebody that we are increasingly all too young to remember, but
What's the one that's like Scientology? American, they don't use medicine.
well, Christian Science doesn't, but it's not like Scientology at all. But it sounds like it because they use similar words. But we'll actually, Christian Science will be one of the ones I talk about next week when we talk about what I call pseudo-Christian cults. Cults that use Christian language in a way that is completely un-Christian, right? That completely redefines the word as opposed to deviating. But Christian Science is a good example. My aunt was involved in Christian Science for a while, and other quacky things. She doesn't use the internet. Yeah. Well, this is a point that I'm going to get to, but any particular group can fall under any combination of these things, right? So you can be a manipulative cult while being theologically orthodox, right? I'm not going to use any examples today, but I'm guessing you can all think of one or two. Yeah? I don't know. Ken Fitch. Yeah, I've never heard the name, so.
I can't tell if he's like genuinely Christian, but like fell off and became kind of like Pentecostal,
Mm-hmm.
or if he's like actually wrong. Like I don't know if he's like a genuine Christian, but just really Christian or Pentecostal,
Mm-hmm.
or if he's actually like
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, nice. Well done. I actually am going to use an example because I really don't think this is exposing anything that people don't know about, okay? An example of a theologically orthodox group that would absolutely fall into this is the Sovereign Grace movement. And that, while we don't agree theologically with, for example, their lack of cessationism, right? They're not, they're Nicene, they believe in salvation by faith alone, but centered around one guy, highly manipulative, abuse, cover-ups, right? That's an example there. Okay, other examples. Charles Manson, obviously, again, before everybody's time. Something I used to hear about a lot growing up, living here in Arizona, was Colorado City, right? So, and that's one of those things that it's a cult of a cult, right? Because it was a very isolated, polygamist, fundamentalist Mormon sect on the Arizona-Utah border. In fact, there was a town, the Arizona side is Colorado City and the Utah side was another town. And they were kind of like twin cities across the river from one another, or across the border from one another. And totally, I mean, really all three, they fit into all three buckets, right? So those are some examples. Any other example? Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and this is another one of those things where you see that like continuum, right? Where you didn't find out a lot of the like really bad stuff until much later, right? And B, on its surface, it doesn't look like Jim Jones, right? But when you examine the practices of the Gothard group, yeah, it definitely really hits all the check boxes when it comes to that. Yeah.
Also, I appreciate your point that these groups may have to be really very manipulative, very heretical, or some combination of
Yeah.
Westboro bastards.
Sure.
Picture that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes they say some Calvinist things that make you scared.
Uh huh.
That they're Calvinists.
Yeah.
And then they say something else that's the same, and you realize because they're cold.
Yeah.
But there are things that they say that sound like biblical Christianity.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I think I thought I had it on the list here. Maybe I have it elsewhere, but I would. Well, okay, I'm actually not. The what? NAR? I don't know. Is anybody familiar with that? The New Apostolic Reformation?
Largely, but
Yeah.
you might be able to ask Sharon, she's not here today.
Oh, okay.
She knows a lot about like Bethel.
Yeah. Okay.
They were on the Cultish podcast had them as
Uh-huh.
their, but then again, that's not cult, that's things that are
Yeah.
cult and cultish. So,
Well, and this actually brings up a really important point. Okay. Just because somebody doesn't cross the line to acquire the cult merit badge doesn't mean what they're doing is not really bad, right? And that's really why I want to emphasize that knowing the authentic is the best remedy, right? Because the response to this group does not line up with theological orthodoxy, right? Is not to just label them as cult and move on, right? It is to identify why are they not orthodox? Where are they at variance with their teaching about the Jesus of the Bible, right? Likewise, whether or not somebody crosses the line all the way into full-blown cult territory, if they're engaging in manipulative practices that are wrong, well, manipulative practices, I repeat myself, right? But if they're engaging in that kind of list of things, right, we should be able to say, doing that is wrong. Covering up the sins of your leaders is wrong. Taking somebody who dissents, especially somebody that dissents politely and in the appropriate context, and demonizing them, casting them out, lying about them, doing things like that, that is cult-like manipulative behavior, right? Even if your institution doesn't rise to the cult label, okay? An example I will give here from personal experience. I grew up, I think I've mentioned this before to many of you, I grew up in a very, very large youth group. When I was in high school and college, I was involved in a youth group that was between high school and junior high, 450 people. So bigger than almost every OP church, right? All but one, maybe. And they engaged in a lot of this kind of stuff. They built an inner circle. They made you really want to be part of it. They spoke poorly about anybody that wasn't involved in the youth group. If somebody graduated from high school and they didn't go on youth staff, but instead went to the college group, or they went away to college, they were talked about as if they were less spiritual. Because the most important thing you could possibly do in life is grow up to be a youth pastor or marry a youth pastor, right? And everything about the way that was set up, when you look back on it, right, you're like, not healthy, right? And any time this got escalated to the elders, right, the person that escalated it, even if they were another elder, would be dismissed, marginalized, scandalized. So not healthy stuff. And there's a lot of people I know from that time, right, that it just made a mess of their lives. It was instrumental in causing them to walk away from the church. It was instrumental in leading them into really self-destructive relationships, right? Not the only thing, right? But it was a factor. And eventually, that pastor was found to have been abusing people. There was a lawsuit and police investigations and all sorts of stuff there. So, as I was saying before, a church can be an example, or a group can be an example of any or all of the above, right? So, the Branch Davidians, right? That's a little bit more recent. All three, right? Certainly they have the structure to fall into that Western religious formal cult category, right? Absolutely heretical, super manipulative, right? we can have little meters, right, for each one, you know, ding 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 ding. The Branch Davidians, they were the group that the FBI set fire to in Texas back in the 90s. Waco, yeah. Yeah, what? Yeah. 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 Yeah, you bring. I mean, there's other things in Waco other than cults and murders. I'm sorry? Yeah, there was a big FBI siege, and then they set fire to the compound, and yeah, it was bad news. Yeah, there's a long discussion that goes with that with that topic. A lot of cult-like churches are A and C, but not necessarily B. And we gave a couple of examples tonight, right? I think one of the things that you see that, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth when we get to this, when we study this particular sort of subject in a little bit more depth, but accountability, right? Orthodoxy is the remedy to this. Accountability is the remedy to this. Yeah. But I mean, even like a functioning Episcopalianism can protect you against this in a way that, what you tend to find is that those that manipulate favor places where they control those who supposedly have accountability over them, right? And so they will tend toward either congregationalist government or what I call the evil hybrid child of congregationalism and Episcopalianism, where there's no denominational accountability. It's an isolated church, but the congregation can't do anything about their leaders either. They don't elect their own leaders. They can't remove their own leaders. They have no mechanism for intervention. And that is a disturbingly common trend, even in non-cult-like groups, and it has had cult-like manifestations. Mars Hill, Harvest, right? Both of those vehemently opposed true congregational government, but they also opposed Presbyterian or Episcopalian government. One of them actually wrote an article called Congregationalism is of the Devil. Yeah.
So do they claim to have an alternative, or is it?
Well, I mean, what they do, I mean, it's really like just textbook manipulation, right? They centered on leaders, charismatic leaders who were the face of the movement, right? And when somebody differed or somebody wanted to hold them accountable or somebody said, hey, you're not living up to the standards you preach, right? They would shun them. But the way they would justify the congregation not having a vote is they would say, you just don't see that anywhere in the New Testament, right? So they would conveniently ignore the Old Testament where clearly the people selected their own elders, right? And instead, the elders chose themselves, right? And once you had your original group, which was usually vetted by the mothership, whether it was in Chicago or Seattle, and once you had that, then your group would pick more people. And you would introduce the elders to the congregation. You would encourage them to get to know their new elders, but they did not get a vote. They did not get a say. And having a say was really taught to be unbiblical.
And if you like prop up the leader or leaders as having some kind of special connection with God or some kind of exciting testimony or calling.
Oh yeah. And one of the things that is really common is success, meaning numerical success and financial success, enables manipulation, right? If somebody is being a big jerk, but they don't have 1 million people buying their books or streaming their podcast or watching them from any of, 100 remote church locations on Sundays streaming their sermon and things like that. If that's not happening, right, they're maybe leading 50 people astray, right? But it takes that sort of charismatic, successful, success-breeding success thing to really enable this on a large scale. But what happens is, if that person ever comes to accountability, the whole structure crumbles, which is what we saw at Mars Hill. Yes.
I just can't recommend enough. If you have, you're in a doctor's office and you have like 20 minutes and there's a desire to run your head through drywall. Google James McDonald, who was the head of Moses, Mark Driscoll, who was the head of North Hill.
Yeah.
So James McDonald, Mark Driscoll's Gospel Coalition, and there will be a video that comes up from 13 years ago.
T.D. Jakes?
No, it's not the
Oh, okay. Okay. So sorry. Go ahead.
It's a different one where they're talking with Mark Dever, who was a
Yeah.
Reformed Baptist on church government,
Yeah.
and the arrogance and anger that those two guys expressed, defending their position,
Oh, yeah.
and like in an adolescent fashion, are really cruel. It's stunning,
Yeah.
and it's stunning that that video was released, and they're wow, this game
Yeah.
is well back in time.
Yeah.
And so Gospel doesn't have it up anymore for obvious reasons. But
That's
it's
good.
still up on YouTube, so
Yeah.
I think it's an excellent picture of everything Rob says. You see in these two men everything Rob's saying, and it just can't help but come out
Yeah.
in the way they're talking. Because not only that, how do they talk to the church government?
They talk about it like they're Moses.
Yeah, it's a very
Yeah.
stunning like 12 minutes.
Yeah. The phrase to watch for in a manipulative church, touch not the Lord's anointed. Right? If your criticism or your dispute is met with that response, good chance. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they see it outside the church, even in the riot with the Crouches, right?
Mhm.
I call it the Zombie Network.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
More with the anointing, like the way they talk about these people. That's a really good. That's a good point too. And they're very shocking positions.
Yeah.
Use this the language that we're all horrified by. Use the actors
Yeah.
some of those places.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things again where our kind of collective American resistance to developing fulsome doctrinal understanding is a factor in these sorts of things, right? Because if we were thinking about ordination and the doctrine of ordination and what it really means in the way that the church thought about it before it got abusive about it, right? Then you would see that is not an appropriate scripture to quote when it comes to that. So we're past 7:30. So I'll go ahead and wrap up this week. Some important things to remember as we study and we interact with cults, and I'll come back and I'll try to reinforce some of these things as we're going throughout our sessions. Don't rush to apply the label cult to groups we simply disagree with or are not comfortable with. Okay, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting, one of the resources that I have used is the sort of go-to resource on cult, right? Is Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults, and although I'm not a huge fan of some of his rhetoric, it's a really useful resource. And he has both a handbook version, which is really helpful if you've never read on this stuff before because it doesn't get too far into the weeds. And then he's got the full Kingdom of the Cults book. It's in its 6th edition. He's long dead, but it's in its 6th edition. It's 1,100 pages long, tons and tons of useful information. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is the way that Walter Martin went out of his way to be charitable regarding Seventh-day Adventism, right? And this is something where it's a really debatable thing. Are they over the line when it comes to doctrine or not, right? We who are very kind of creedal and confessional would probably say, oh, man, they're really, really out there, right? But when he would sit down and actually meet with them and meet with their leaders, what he found was they were far more orthodox than it seemed to be on the surface. And he's got like a whole chapter in there on that experience, right? And I'm not weighing in one side or the other. I'm not even remotely qualified to say, only to say that we shouldn't rush to put that label on a group just because they're weird, right? Or there's like, this seems so out of line, not with what we know we believe, but just the way we done it, right? So we need to be careful about that. We need to also distinguish between cults as movements and institutions and their particular followers, right? And this particularly is important when you get on the edge or on the line, right? Somebody that's a member of a cult, right? The best thing we can think about them, the most charitable thing we can think about them, is they are in bondage, right? They are not the enemy. And what we want to do is understand them, help them understand orthodoxy, right? And recognize that somebody can be a member of a kind of a kooky group, or and even a fully apostate group, and actually have a true faith, although probably immature, right? So we just need to be careful. Always differentiate between the institution and the movement and the individual followers. Remember, there is a difference between a cult and a false and or apostate religion, right? We wouldn't call Hinduism a cult, right? In any meaningful way other than kind of number one, right? Islam itself is, it's number one, but internally, there are cultic Islamic groups and there are non-cultic Islamic groups when it comes to manipulation, same thing with heresy. Cults can on occasion cease to be cults. This is another, it's not common. It is real. Usually they implode, right? But one example, I remember, we were talking about this on Sunday. In the 90s, I used to listen to the Bible Answer Man broadcast a lot on the radio. And one of the things Hank Hanegraaff, who was the Bible Answer Man at the time after Walter Martin died, and before he himself became EO, he talked about working with the Worldwide Church of God, which was unquestionably a cult. They were, I believe, modalists in their belief in God. And when their original leadership died, the remaining leadership were receptive to the teachings of Scripture and the interaction with other men from the Orthodox faith, and they came to a fully, consistently Nicene Trinitarian belief about the Trinity. So, power of God unto salvation, right? And again, I'll say this over and over and over, strive to know Jesus. Know the real thing so that you can more easily spot the counterfeits. Final questions?